Okay, so all of our examples we've looked at so far have assumed that the borrower continues to generate enough cash to cover their outstanding debt. But what if things don't go that way? This lesson is on troubled debt restructuring. And basically, that's the situation where you run into trouble and you can't repay your debt. So, to get us started thinking about this, I want you to think about what we mean when we hear the word default, or what it means when we hear that word. It basically means the borrower cannot meet the terms of the original agreement. And there are different degrees, if you will, of default. There's technical default. And in technical default, this means that in the original agreement, the lender oftentimes will specify certain constraints on the borrower to protect the likelihood of receiving all the interest and principal payments. For example, the lender might specify levels of certain financial ratios, like your current ratio has to be above 1.25, or your debt to asset ratio must be below 50%. I know you remember those ratios from your earlier accounting classes. Or sometimes the lender might specify that the borrowed money can't be used for certain purposes. These requirements then mean that the lender must periodically review the borrower's financial statements to make sure the terms are being met. If they're not met, then this is called technical default on the part of the borrower. While the agreement may indicate the lender has the right to demand payment in full at the point of technical default, this doesn't usually happen. Usually what happens is the lender and the borrower will just renegotiate some of the terms. Just FYI, there's a job that a lot of people have of watching how borrowers use the lender's money for different types of lenders, and it's referred to as performing due diligence. A lot of that work now can be done by AI tools. But it's still, you will come across people, that's what they do, due diligence. It's usually what they're talking about. So technical default is one kind of default. The other kind of default, just plain old default, is when the cash payments due to the lender are not paid. So in this situation, the lender and the borrower need to look to the agreement to determine the best way forward to minimize the loss that is faced by the lender. In the extreme, the lender can force the borrower to liquidate assets to raise the cash, but usually something less extreme is worked out. The working out of a new agreement is what we call troubled debt restructuring. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So there's basically two broad forms of troubled debt restructuring. Okay, two alternatives, if you will. One is settlement. The first one is settlement. In this situation, the lender and the borrower agree that the lender is going to accept some amount of cash or some other asset to consider that debt settled. Right? So we'll look at examples of that. Maybe that the borrower has some property that they can transfer to the lender, and the lender agrees to accept that payment. If the settlement is the way this goes, then the borrower is going to remove that note payable or that debt from the books and remove the property, and there would be a gain or loss. And we'll look at examples of that. You'll see those in your reading. Settlement. The other big picture idea of troubled debt restructuring is when the debt continues going forward, but new terms are put in place. And the terms might mean that the borrower is going to end up paying less than the original agreement, or the terms might mean that the borrower ends up paying more than the original agreement. So we're going to look at examples in both of those cases. So basically, we're going to look at three different activities related to troubled debt restructuring. One, when we just flat out settle the debt immediately. And then we're going to look at one situation where we continue and have payments in the future, but they total less than the original agreement. And another situation where we continue to make payments later into the future, but they total more than the original agreement. Troubled debt restructuring. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson.